"Sir, that woman has been walking in the rain for almost 2 hours." The billionaire never looked away from the window. "Good," Grayson Sterling said quietly, because people only show who they truly are when life becomes difficult." Outside the black Maybach, the woman kept walking. Soaked shoes, frozen hands, a plastic bag pressed tightly against her chest like it contained the last hope she had left in the world. And neither of them knew yet that this rainy morning was about to change both of their lives forever. At 7:12, that Monday morning, Manhattan looked cold enough to break a person's spirit. Rain streamed down the glass towers of downtown like silver veins. Taxi tires hissed across the wet pavement. Men in expensive coats rushed beneath umbrellas without looking at one another. The city moved fast, efficient, and emotionless, exactly the way Grayson Sterling preferred it. Inside the warm silence of the Maybach, Grayson sat motionless in the back seat. At 52 years old, the founder of Sterling Logistics had become one of the most powerful men in American business. Financial magazines described him as disciplined. Investors called him visionary. Employees used another word, untouchable. Grayson did not mind. Distance protected people from disappointment. Trust, on the other hand, ruined lives. 2 years earlier, his former chief operating officer, Elliot Crane, had stolen $23 million from the company using fake transportation contracts hidden deep inside the accounting system. Elliot had not been merely an employee. He had been Grayson's closest friend for nearly 15 years. The betrayal hardened something inside him. Since then, Grayson no longer trusted resumes, polished interviews, or carefully rehearsed answers. Anyone could memorize the right words for 30 minutes inside a conference room. Character was different. Character appeared when things became uncomfortable. So Grayson quietly developed a hiring philosophy. Nobody inside the company fully understood. He watched applicants before the interview. How they treated security guards, how they handled delays, how they responded when nobody important seemed to be watching. Most people failed immediately. This morning, however, one applicant had captured his attention before sunrise. Michaela Price. Grayson opened the thin folder resting on his lap. 40 years old, single mother, 14 months unemployed, previous eviction filing, no executive-level experience. At the bottom of the resume, Dean Whitaker had written a short note in red ink. Not qualified. Grayson stared at the words for several seconds before closing the folder again. Outside the rain-covered window, Michaela continued walking down Lexington Avenue. "She turned down shelter twice already," Owen said from the front seat. "Coffee shop on 48th. Pharmacy entrance on 52nd. Grayson remained silent. Michaela wore an old navy blazer darkened by rainwater. Her running shoes were soaked through completely. One hand held a cheap plastic bag tightly beneath her coat, protecting paperwork. Most applicants would have canceled the interview hours ago. The storm had shut down multiple bus routes before dawn. Yet she kept going. The Maybach rolled quietly half a block behind her. "She's going to get sick," Owen muttered. Grayson finally answered. "Words are free, Owen." His voice remained calm. "That's why they mean so little." Outside, Michaela suddenly stopped near a flooded crosswalk. For 3 seconds, she did not move. Grayson noticed everything immediately. The exhaustion in her posture, the trembling in her shoulders, the look of someone standing dangerously close to giving up. Then slowly she opened the plastic bag. She checked the documents inside, still dry. A tiny breath escaped her lips, and then something happened. Grayson did not expect. She smiled, not happily, not confidently. Just a small, stubborn smile from someone refusing to let the world take the final piece of dignity she still possessed. Then she stepped forward again into the rain. Something tightened unexpectedly in Grayson's chest. For a brief moment, the woman outside disappeared, replaced by another image entirely. His mother. 33 years earlier, Eleanor Sterling had walked through a snowstorm after her car broke down during a hospital night shift. She arrived home, exhausted just before sunrise, changed clothes, then attended Grayson's school debate competition without ever mentioning how much pain she was in. Nobody had rescued her. Nobody had stopped, yet somehow she never lost her kindness. Grayson slowly looked away from the window. Rain blurred the city lights into silver streaks. "The strongest people," he said quietly, almost to himself, "rarely look strong at all." The car became silent again. Ahead of them, Michaela Price disappeared briefly behind a curtain of rain, still walking toward a building where nearly everyone had already decided she did not belong. Everyone except one man. And even Grayson Sterling did not yet understand why he could not stop watching her. "At this price, you'd have to walk, Mom." The Uber driver canceled 3 seconds later. Michaela stared at the screen in silence as the rain battered the apartment window beside her. Then another notification appeared. Bus service suspended due to severe weather. For a long moment, she simply sat there in the dark, listening to the storm and the soft breathing of her little girl asleep nearby. $6.40. That was all she had left in the world. And the interview that could change her life was nearly 6 miles away. At 4:15 that Monday morning, the apartment smelled faintly of old radiator heat and instant coffee. Technically, it was not even Michaela's apartment. It belonged to Lorraine Watkins, a retired school cafeteria worker who had allowed Michaela and her daughter to stay temporarily after their eviction. 6 months earlier. Lorraine called the tiny second bedroom cozy. In truth, it was barely large enough for a mattress, a folding chair, and the small dresser holding everything Michaela still owned. Rain tapped steadily against the cracked window. Michaela sat at the edge of the mattress with her phone in one hand and her wallet in the other. $6.40. She counted it anyway. A $5 bill. $1, 2 quarters, 1 dime, 1 nickel. Not enough for a ride into Manhattan. Not enough for another canceled opportunity. Across the room, 5-year-old Zuri slept curled beneath a faded yellow blanket. One tiny hand wrapped around a worn stuffed rabbit missing part of one ear. Michaela watched her daughter carefully. Children should not understand financial fear. But lately, Zuri had begun noticing things. Why Mommy skipped dinner sometimes. Why they moved apartments so suddenly. Why the refrigerator looked emptier every week. The thought alone hurt more than hunger ever could. Michaela quietly stood and walked toward the kitchenette. She filled a mug with tap water and added the last spoonful of instant coffee from the jar. The taste was weak and bitter, but at least it was warm. Her interview at Sterling Logistics was scheduled for 9 a.m. One interview. After 14 months of rejection emails, silence, and humiliating follow-up calls, she had finally received one real opportunity. She could not lose it. Not because of rain. Not because life had become difficult. Not now. Her phone buzzed again, another rideshare estimate. $48.20. Michaela laughed softly to herself. Not the laughter of amusement, the laughter of someone too exhausted to cry anymore. Behind her, Lorraine slowly appeared in the doorway, wearing a robe and slippers. "You're awake already?" the older woman whispered. Michaela nodded. "The buses are canceled." Lorraine frowned immediately. "Lord, have mercy." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Lorraine walked closer and lowered her voice carefully. "You can reschedule, honey." Michaela looked down at the coffee in her hands. 14 months. 14 months of hearing. "We chose another candidate. We're moving in a different direction. We'll keep your resume on file." 14 months of pretending she still believed things would improve. "If I reschedule," she said quietly, "they'll forget me before lunchtime." Lorraine's face softened with sadness because she understood exactly what Michaela meant. People with stable lives often believed opportunity waited patiently. Poor people knew better. Opportunity moved on quickly. Michaela returned to the bedroom and opened the small closet beside the dresser. Hanging inside was the only blazer she still owned. Navy blue, slightly faded at the sleeves, carefully cleaned by hand in Lorraine's sink 2 nights earlier. She touched the fabric gently before putting it on. Then came the shoes. Old running shoes, clean but worn thin at the soles, not ideal for an interview, but they were all she had left. Finally, Michaela reached for the plastic grocery bag resting beside the dresser. Inside were copies of her resume, references, identification, and a notebook filled with handwritten reminders she had studied every night for 2 weeks. She wrapped the papers carefully inside another layer of plastic, protecting them from the storm. Protecting, perhaps, the final version of herself that still believed tomorrow could be different. Behind her, a small, sleepy voice suddenly spoke. "Mama?" Michaela turned immediately. Zuri sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. "You leaving already?" Michaela crossed the room and sat beside her daughter. "Just for a little while, baby." Zuri noticed the blazer instantly. "The important interview?" Michaela smiled softly. "That's right." The little girl reached beneath her blanket and pulled out a folded piece of purple paper. "I made this yesterday." Michaela opened it carefully. Written in uneven crayon letters were 4 simple words. "You can do it." Her throat tightened immediately. "Oh, sweetheart." Zuri leaned forward and kissed her cheek. "You always tell me brave people keep going." Michaela closed her eyes for one brief second. Sometimes children repeated our words back to us exactly when we needed them most. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Lorraine appeared again near the doorway. "You still thinking about walking?" Michaela looked toward the dark rain beyond the window. Then she folded Zuri's note carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of her blazer. "Yes," she said quietly. And a few minutes later, before sunrise touched the city, Michaela Price stepped out into the freezing rain carrying $6, a plastic bag full of paperwork, and the fragile hope of a mother with nowhere left to fall. "Miss, are you really going to walk all the way downtown in this?" The gas station clerk stared at Michaela's soaked blazer, then at the rain pouring beyond the glass doors. Michaela tightened her grip around the plastic bag under her coat. "I have an interview at 9. The young man blinked. "In this weather?" She looked outside at the gray morning swallowing the city. Then she gave him the smallest smile, especially in this weather. By 5:08 a.m., the rain had already found every weak place in Michaela Price's clothing. It slid beneath the collar of her blazer, soaked through the cuffs of her sleeves, and gathered inside her old running shoes until each step made a soft, humiliating sound against the sidewalk. Squish, squish, squish. She hated that sound. It was the sound of not having better shoes, the sound of not having options, the sound of a woman trying to arrive at a corporate interview, looking professional while the city itself seemed determined to remind her how far she had fallen. But she kept walking. The streets were still half asleep. Delivery trucks rolled past with their headlights glowing through the rain. Storefront gates rattled in the wind. A man under a green awning smoked a cigarette and watched her pass as if she were part of the weather. Michaela lowered her head and moved forward. 6 miles. That was what the map had said. 5 miles and some change if she cut through side streets. But in the rain, distance felt different. A single block could become a test of patience. A crosswalk could feel like a river. A gust of wind could steal the breath from your chest and make you wonder whether pride was worth freezing for. At 5:34, she stopped beneath the narrow awning of a closed bakery. Her fingers were stiff, her stomach cramped with hunger. She had eaten half a piece of toast before leaving Lorraine's apartment and saved the other half for Zuri. Because mothers had a quiet way of doing that kind of math. Michaela leaned against the brick wall and closed her eyes. For one dangerous moment, the thought came clearly. Go back, call them. Tell them the buses were canceled. Tell them the weather made it impossible. A reasonable person would understand. But Michaela had lived long enough to know that reasonable was often a luxury granted to people who already had stability. When you were poor, people called your obstacles excuses. When you were struggling, they expected your life to be neat before they offered help. She opened her eyes and looked down at the plastic grocery bag pressed beneath her coat. Her resume, her references, her identification, her proof that she was still trying. Carefully, she pulled the bag open just enough to check. The papers inside were dry, perfectly dry. A breath shook out of her. Not relief, exactly. Something smaller, something more sacred. If I can keep this dry, she whispered to herself, I can keep going. She stepped back into the rain. By 6:02, the city had begun to wake. Commuters hurried past in dark coats, their umbrellas tilted against the wind. Nobody was cruel, not openly, but most people looked through her. That almost felt worse. Michaela had learned that invisibility did not always mean being unseen. Sometimes it meant being seen and quietly dismissed. At the corner of 57th, a black SUV swept too close to the curb. Dirty water exploded from a puddle and splashed across her legs, her blazer, and the side of her face. For a second, Michaela stood frozen. Cold water ran down her cheek. Her shoes filled completely. A man nearby winced and said, "Ouch," but kept walking. Michaela did not blame him. Everyone in the city was late for something. Still, some things inside her trembled. Not anger, not even sadness, just exhaustion. The kind that makes a person feel very small. She looked up at the pale morning sky hidden behind rain clouds and thought of Zuri asleep beneath the yellow blanket. She thought of Lorraine's tired eyes. She thought of the eviction notice folded in a drawer. She thought of every rejection email that had begun with polite words and ended with another closed door. Then she heard Zuri's little voice in her memory. "You always tell me brave people keep going." Michaela pressed one hand over the pocket where the purple crayon note rested. The paper was still there, warm against her heart. Her lips trembled, but she did not cry. Not yet. She lifted her chin and took one step, then another. Squish, squish, squish. Somewhere behind her, half a block away, a black Maybach moved slowly through traffic. Michaela did not see it. She did not know that a billionaire was watching from behind tinted glass. She did not know that her quiet battle with the rain had already become more powerful than anything written on her resume. All she knew was this: if she stopped, nothing would change. If she kept walking, maybe everything would. So Michaela Price walked on through the cold Manhattan morning, carrying her dry papers beneath her coat like a candle shielded from the wind. "Sir, with respect, this is no longer an observation. This is suffering." Owen kept both hands on the wheel, but his eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror. Grayson Sterling did not answer. Through the rain-streaked window of the Maybach, he watched Michaela Price pause at a crosswalk, her blazer heavy with water, one hand pressed over the plastic bag beneath her coat. Owen slowed the car. "We could offer her a ride and still interview her," he said quietly. "It wouldn't change who she is." Grayson's jaw tightened. "No," he said. Outside, the traffic light changed. Michaela stepped forward, and the Maybach followed at a respectful distance. For almost an hour, Grayson had watched her move through Manhattan's cold morning without once knowing she was being observed. She had taken no shortcuts that required dishonesty. She had shoved no one aside. She had stopped twice to check the documents in her bag, and both times she had continued only after making sure they were still dry. That detail stayed with him. Not her soaked hair, not her worn shoes, not even the fact that she had refused to give up. The papers. She was protecting the possibility of a future more carefully than most executives protected million-dollar contracts. Grayson had seen enough polished applicants in his lifetime to know the difference between ambition and desperation. Ambition wanted applause. Desperation wanted a door. Michaela did not look like a woman chasing status. She looked like a woman trying to keep one small promise to herself. Owen cleared his throat. "May I ask something, sir?" Grayson kept looking out the window. You always do. Why her? That question settled inside the car. Grayson did not respond at first. Rain clicked softly against the roof. The leather seats smelled faintly of cedar and old money. The heater hummed with the kind of comfort most people only noticed when they had lived without it. Finally, Grayson said, because everyone else already decided. Owen glanced back. Decided what? That she was not worth the risk. He reached for the folder beside him and opened it again. Michaela Price, 40 years old, single mother, 14 months unemployed, and administrative background, financial hardship, no elite degree, no corporate pedigree. On paper, she was easy to dismiss. That troubled him, not because the file was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Grayson knew better than most men that records could tell the facts of a life without revealing its meaning. A poor credit score could mean irresponsibility, or it could mean a hospital bill, a lost job, a child's illness, a month where rent and food had stood across from each other like enemies. An employment gap could mean laziness, or it could mean a person had knocked on 100 locked doors and was still standing. He closed the folder. Words are free, Owen, he said. Owen sighed softly. You say that often, because it remains true. Outside, Michaela was approaching another wide intersection. The wind pushed hard against her, turning her umbrella-less walk into something almost painful to watch. Grayson's expression shifted, though only slightly. Long ago, before his name appeared on buildings, before wealth turned every room polite around him, he had been a boy standing beside his mother in a narrow grocery aisle while she counted coins in her palm. Eleanor Sterling had worked night shifts at St. Vincent's Hospital and cleaned offices on weekends. She owned 2 pairs of shoes, one for church and one for everything else. One winter night, when Grayson was 19, her car broke down 12 miles from home. She walked through freezing weather because she had no money for a cab and refused to miss work. The next afternoon, she sat in the front row of his college debate, smiling as if her feet were not swollen inside old shoes. He had asked her later why she had not called someone. She had simply said, "Son, sometimes you learn what you're made of because nobody comes." That sentence had filled him, and perhaps, in ways he rarely admitted, it had also wounded him. Owen's voice softened. Your mother would have stopped the car. Grayson turned toward him then. The words landed too close to truth. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, Grayson looked back out the window. I know. Michaela stumbled slightly on the curb, but caught herself. She pressed one hand against a street lamp, took a breath, then checked the plastic bag again. Still dry, still worth protecting. Something moved behind Grayson's eyes, something older than business and sharper than pride. He had told himself this was a test, a way to measure character before investing trust. But as he watched Michaela straighten her shoulders and continue through the rain, another thought entered quietly, unwelcome and undeniable. Maybe she was not the one being tested. Maybe he was. The Maybach rolled forward through the gray morning, warm, silent, and painfully close, to a woman who had no idea help was following her half a block behind. And for the first time in years, Grayson Sterling wondered whether watching strengths from a distance was wisdom or just another form of cowardice. "Mama, are you still walking?" The tiny voice came through the phone so softly that Michaela had to stop beneath the dripping awning of a closed flower shop just to hear it. For one moment, the whole city seemed to quiet around her. The rain still fell. Cars still passed. Wind still pushed cold water against her face. But all Michaela heard was her daughter. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "Mama's still walking." On the little screen, Zuri Price sat wrapped in the faded yellow blanket from Lorraine's guest room. Her curls were slightly messy from sleep, and her worn, stuffed rabbit rested against her shoulder. Behind her, Lorraine moved slowly through the kitchen, pretending not to listen while she prepared oatmeal with more water than milk. Zuri leaned closer to the phone. "Are your shoes wet?" Michaela looked down. Her old running shoes were soaked completely through. Water pressed between her toes with every small shift of weight. Her socks felt heavy. Her feet were beginning to ache in a deep, dull way that frightened her a little. But she smiled anyway, a little. Zuri narrowed her eyes with the serious expression only a 5-year-old could manage. "That means yes." Michaela almost laughed. Almost. Instead, her eyes filled. She turned slightly away from the street so no passerby would see her face breaking open. "Don't worry about me, sweetheart. I'm okay." Zuri was quiet for a second. Then she lifted something toward the camera, a folded piece of purple paper. Michaela's breath caught. "You still have it?" Zuri asked. Michaela reached inside the inner pocket of her blazer. Her fingers found the note, dry and warm beneath the layers of wet cloth. She pulled it out carefully. The crayon letters were uneven, large, and beautiful. "You can do it." Michaela pressed the note against her chest. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "I have it right here." Zuri smiled. "You can do it, Mama." There were words that sounded small until life placed them in the right moment. Then they became shelter. Michaela closed her eyes as tears mixed with rain on her cheeks. She thought about every time she had told Zuri to be brave at the dentist. On the first day at a new preschool, during the night, they packed their things and left the apartment they could no longer afford. She had taught her daughter courage with a voice she did not always believe herself. Now that courage was returning to her in purple crayon. "I love you," Michaela whispered. "I love you more," Zuri said. Lorraine gently took the phone. "You listen to me?" the older woman said, her voice low and firm. "You have nothing to prove to anybody." Michaela looked out at the rain. For a moment, she saw herself in the glass of the flower shop window, soaked blazer, tired eyes, damp hair, plastic bag held close like a secret. "I know," she said softly, "but I have something to prove to myself." Lorraine did not answer right away. Then she said, "Then walk with God, baby." The call ended. Michaela stood still beneath the awning, holding the phone in one hand and the purple note in the other. Across the street, the morning traffic had grown heavier. Office workers moved quickly under umbrellas, clean and dry inside lives that seemed to have roofs over every part of them. Michaela folded the note and placed it back into her blazer pocket. Then she stepped into the rain again. 2 blocks later, a silver sedan slowed beside the curb. A woman in her late 60s lowered the passenger window. She had kind eyes and a gray scarf tucked neatly around her neck. "Honey," the woman called. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" Michaela stopped. The offer landed in her chest with such tenderness that it almost hurt. "Yes," her body answered silently. "Yes, I'm tired. Yes, I'm cold. Yes, I am trying not to fall apart on a city sidewalk before sunrise." But her mouth said something else. "Thank you, Mom. Truly. But I'm all right." The woman frowned gently. "You don't look all right." That nearly broke her. Michaela swallowed hard and adjusted the plastic bag beneath her coat. "I have an interview," she said, "and I think I need to arrive knowing I made it there myself." The woman studied her for a long second, not with judgment, with understanding. Then she nodded. "Well then," she said, "I'll be praying you get that job." Michaela smiled through the rain. "Thank you." The sedan pulled away slowly. Half a block behind, inside the black Maybach, Owen watched the whole exchange. "She turned down help," he said. Grayson Sterling did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on Michaela as she continued walking, slower now, but somehow stronger than before. At last he spoke. "No," Grayson said quietly. "She accepted kindness. She just didn't let it carry her." Owen looked at him in the mirror. Grayson's face was still composed, but something in his voice had changed. Outside, Michaela pressed one hand over the pocket where Zuri's purple note rested. The rain had not stopped. The city had not softened. The road had not become easier. But somewhere between her daughter's voice and a stranger's kindness, Michaela found a strength that did not feel like pride anymore. It felt like purpose. So she kept walking. Not because she had no fear, but because someone's small, sleeping under a yellow blanket, believed her mother could reach the other side of the storm. "Ma, are you here for an interview?" The security guard behind the front desk looked at Michaela Price as if he was not sure whether to offer directions or a towel. For a brief second, Michaela stood in the marble lobby of Sterling Logistics, with rain dripping from the hem of her blazer onto the polished floor. Then she lifted her chin. "Yes," she said, holding the plastic bag against her chest. 9 o'clock. Michaela Price. The guard glanced at the clock behind him. 8:51 a.m., 9 minutes early. Something in his expression changed. Not much, just enough to become respect. The headquarters of Sterling Logistics rose above Manhattan, like a building made of glass and quiet judgment. Everything inside seemed too clean, too bright, carefully arranged for someone who had just walked nearly 6 miles through a storm. The floors shone beneath soft white lights. The reception desk looked like carved stone. Fresh flowers stood in a silver vase near the elevators, their petals untouched by weather, hunger, or worry. Michaela suddenly became painfully aware of herself. Her soaked blazer, her damp hair, her worn shoes, the cold water inside her socks. But she did not look down. A woman could be wet and still be dignified. She had learned that somewhere between the 3rd mile and the 4th. The guard cleared his throat gently. "Restroom is down that hall to the left. Human Resources is on the 22nd floor." "Thank you," Michaela said. Her voice was calm, but the moment she entered the restroom and locked herself inside a stall, her hands began to shake. Not from fear, from relief. She had made it. Not gracefully, not comfortably. Not the way she had imagined when she first applied for the job. But she had made it. Michaela stepped out of the stall and stood before the mirror. For a moment, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Rain had loosened strands of hair around her face. Her cheeks were cold. Her eyes were tired in a way makeup could never hide. Still, beneath the exhaustion, there was something steady. She removed her blazer and pressed paper towels against the sleeves, the collar, the front panels. She could not dry it completely, but she could make it presentable. She smoothed her hair as best she could, wiped water from her shoes, and straightened the collar of her blouse. Then came the most important part. She placed the plastic bag on the counter and opened it with almost ceremonial care. Inside, wrapped in a second layer of plastic, were her documents. Resume, references, identification, a small notebook of interview notes. Dry, perfectly dry. Michaela stared at them, and for the first time that morning she smiled without forcing it. "Thank you," she whispered, though she was not sure whether she was speaking to God, to Zuri, to Lorraine, or to the part of herself that had refused to turn back. At 8:57, she stepped out of the elevator onto the 22nd floor. The waiting area outside Human Resources was quiet and tastefully decorated, with cream-colored chairs, framed photographs of cargo ships and delivery fleets, and a glass wall overlooking the city. 3 other applicants were already seated. One man in a tailored gray suit looked up from his phone and paused. A younger woman with perfect hair glanced at Michaela's damp shoes, then quickly looked away. The third applicant smiled politely, but not warmly. Michaela sat in the farthest chair and placed her dry resume folder carefully on her lap. A whisper moved through the small room. "Did she walk here?" The man in the gray suit gave a short laugh under his breath. Michaela heard it. Of course she heard it, but she had no energy left to spend on embarrassment. She opened her notebook and reviewed her prepared answers. Operational coordination, vendor communication, rote scheduling, problem solving under pressure. That last phrase made her almost laugh. Under pressure. Some people wrote it on resumes. Some people walked through it before breakfast. A few minutes later, the HR assistant, Janine, entered carrying a paper cup with steam rising from the lid. She looked directly at Michaela. Miss Price?" Michaela stood halfway. "Yes." Janine handed her the cup. "Hot coffee cream, no sugar." Michaela blinked. "I'm so sorry. Someone asked me to bring it to you." Michaela looked toward the hallway. "Who?" Janine only smiled gently. "Someone who noticed you might need it." Michaela wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth spread into her fingers first, then slowly into her chest. It was not charity, not pity, just a small kindness offered without a speech. "Thank you," she said softly. Janine nodded and returned to her desk. Behind the glass wall of a private office farther down the hall, Grayson Sterling stood unseen, watching Michaela lower herself back into the chair. He noticed she did not drink the coffee immediately. First she set it beside her. Then she opened her folder again, checked the resume, smoothed the page, prepared herself. Grayson's expression remained unreadable, but inside him something quiet had shifted. She had arrived soaked, but her papers were dry. Her hands were trembling, but her posture was straight. The others in the room had brought polished shoes and perfect confidence. Michaela Price had brought something harder to find: proof. At exactly 9 a.m., Janine opened the conference room door. "Mrs. Price," she said, "they're ready for you." Michaela stood. She pressed one hand briefly over the pocket where Zuri's purple crayon note rested. Then she picked up her dry resume, took one steady breath, and walked toward the door as if the rain had not defeated her at all. Because it hadn't. Price, the man at the end of the conference table, said, "Why didn't you simply reschedule?" Michaela felt every eye turn toward her. Her blazer was still damp at the sleeves. Her shoes were still wet beneath the polished table. Her hands rested neatly over the dry resume. She had carried 6 miles through the rain. For one quiet second, she thought of Zuri's purple crayon note tucked against her heart. Then she looked at the billionaire sitting across from her and answered softly, "Because I have been waiting 14 months for one door to open. And when a door finally opens, sir, you do not ask the rain for permission to walk through it." The room went still. 10 minutes earlier, Michaela had entered the conference room expecting 2 interviewers. Patricia Hollis, Director of Human Resources, sat on the left with a tablet in front of her and reading glasses balanced low on her nose. She had the calm, practiced expression of a woman who had interviewed hundreds of people and could recognize panic before an applicant said a word. Dean Whitaker, as Vice President of Operations, sat on the right. His gray suit was sharp, his posture straight, and his face carried the unmistakable look of a man who had already made up his mind. Between them, at the head of the table, was an empty chair. Michaela noticed it immediately, but she said nothing. "Good morning, Miss Price," Patricia began. "Thank you for coming in, despite the weather." "Thank you for seeing me," Michaela replied. Her voice sounded calmer than she felt. Dean glanced at her resume. "You were an administrative coordinator at Bellmark Supply for 6 years." "Yes, sir. And you left 14 months ago." "The company downsized after a regional merger." Dean's eyes moved across the page. "No degree in logistics. No large-scale routing experience. No enterprise operations certification." "No, sir," Michaela said. "Not formally." "Then why Sterling Logistics?" The question was not rude. That almost made it harder. Michaela took a breath. "Because your company solves problems that affect real people. Deliveries are not just numbers on a screen. They are medicine reaching a clinic, food reaching a store, equipment reaching a business before doors open. I may not have your preferred background, but I understand coordination. I understand pressure. And I understand what happens when one small delay creates 10 larger ones." Patricia looked up from her notes. Dean did not. Before he could ask the next question, the conference room door opened. Both interviewers stood immediately. Michaela turned. Grayson Sterling walked in without announcement. She recognized him from magazine covers and company videos. 52 years old, composed silver beginning at the temples, eyes that seemed to notice what other people tried to hide. "Please continue, he said, taking the empty chair. Patricia's face remained professional, but her surprise showed for half a second. Dean straightened his papers. Michaela felt her heartbeat change. The CEO himself was sitting in her interview. Grayson did not look at the resume first. He looked at her. Not her wet cuffs, not her worn shoes. Her Miss Price, he said. How did you get here this morning? Michaela's fingers tightened slightly around the folder. I walked. Dean's eyebrows lifted. Patricia paused her pen. All the way? Grayson asked. Yes, sir. In this storm? Yes, sir. Why? There it was. Not a business question, not a technical question. Something deeper. Michaela could have softened the truth. She could have said she enjoyed walking, or that the weather was not so bad. But poverty had already taken enough from her. She would not let it take her honesty, too. The buses were canceled, she said. A ride was more than I had, and this interview mattered. Dean glanced down, uncomfortable now. Grayson leaned back slightly. You could have called. Yes, sir, you could have asked to reschedule. Yes, sir. Then why didn't you? The question settled over the room like a held breath. Michaela thought of the morning darkness in Lorraine's apartment. She thought of counting $6.40. She thought of Zuri asking if this was the important interview. She thought of dirty rainwater splashing across her blazer while strangers kept walking. Then she answered. Because I have been waiting 14 months for one door to open. And when a door finally opens, sir, you do not ask the rain for permission to walk through it. No one spoke. For the first time since entering the room, Dean Whitaker looked at Michaela as if he were seeing the person beyond the file. Patricia slowly lowered her pen. Grayson remained very still. Behind his composed expression, memory rose without permission. His mother in her old winter coat, her swollen feet hidden inside church shoes, her tired smile from the front row of his college debate, her voice saying, Son, sometimes you learn what you're made of because nobody comes. Across the table sat a woman who had learned the same lesson and somehow had not become hard. Grayson looked at the resume in front of him now, then at the woman who had protected it from the storm. Miss Price, he said quietly, tell me about a time you solved a problem no one asked you to solve. Michaela sat a little straighter, and for the next 20 minutes she spoke, not like a desperate applicant begging for a chance, but like a woman who had been preparing her whole life for someone to finally listen. She told them about reorganizing vendor calls at Bellmark Supply when deliveries were repeatedly late. She explained how she created a color-coded tracking sheet before the company could afford new software. She described calming angry clients, finding missing invoices, and identifying patterns in small errors before they became expensive ones. Dean asked sharper questions. This time, Michaela answered everyone. Not perfectly, honestly. When she did not know something, she said so. When she could learn it, she said how. When Dean challenged her lack of formal logistics training, she did not flinch. I understand I'm not the easiest choice on paper, she said, but I have never needed easy to do good work. Grayson watched Patricia write that sentence down. At 9:42, the interview ended. Michaela stood, thanked each of them, and walked out with her folder held close. When the door closed, Dean exhaled. She's underqualified. Patricia said nothing. Grayson looked toward the rain-streaked windows. No, he said, she's underestimated. Dean turned to him. That is not the same as being ready. Grayson's gaze remained steady. Then we will find out. Outside the conference room, Michaela stood alone for a moment in the hallway. Her legs ached. Her shoes were still damp. Her coffee had gone lukewarm, but her resume was dry. Her voice had not broken. And for the first time in 14 months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the rain had not been an ending. Maybe it had been the beginning. Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, hiring her would be a risk. Dean Whitaker stood beside the conference table with Michaela Price's resume in his hand, as if the paper itself had already given him all the answers he needed. Grayson Sterling looked through the glass wall toward the hallway where Michaela had disappeared moments earlier. "No," he said quietly. "Not hiring her would be the risk." Dean frowned. Patricia Hollis remained seated, her pen resting across her notebook. She had not spoken much since Michaela left the room, but her expression had changed. The skepticism she carried at the beginning of the interview had softened into something more thoughtful. Dean tapped the resume with one finger. "She has no logistics degree, no enterprise routing certification, no experience with our systems. She has been out of work for 14 months. We are not a charity, Grayson." Grayson turned then. His face remained calm, but his eyes sharpened. "I know exactly what we are." The room went quiet. Outside the windows, Manhattan was still blurred by rain. Far below, cars moved like dark beads along wet streets. The whole city seemed to be rushing somewhere, judging everyone by how quickly they could keep up. Grayson placed both hands on the back of the chair. "Skills can be taught," he said. "Discipline can be trained. Software can be learned." Dean opened his mouth, but Grayson continued. "What I watched this morning cannot be taught in a training manual." Patricia looked up. "You watched her?" Grayson did not deny it. "I watched a woman protect a resume through 6 miles of rain because the opportunity mattered to her. I watched her refuse to blame the weather, the bus system, or the cost of a ride. I watched her arrive 9 minutes early when most people in her situation would have never shown up." Dean's jaw tightened. "That still does not mean she can do the job." "No," Grayson said. "It means she deserves the chance to prove whether she can." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Patricia quietly turned one page in her notes. "She was honest when she didn't know an answer," she said. "That matters." Dean looked at her. Patricia continued. "And she understands operational pressure better than some applicants with better titles." Dean sighed. Grayson picked up Michaela's resume and set it neatly in the center of the table. 90 days, he said. Probationary operations associate. Standard pay, full expectations. No special treatment. Dean stared at him. "And if she fails?" "Then she fails honestly," Grayson replied. "But if she succeeds, we will have found what this company keeps claiming it wants." "What is that?" Grayson's voice lowered. "A person who does not quit when things become inconvenient." That afternoon, Michaela received the call while sitting at Lorraine's kitchen table. Zuri was coloring beside her. Lorraine was pretending to fold towels while clearly listening to every word. When Michaela heard Patricia Hollis say, "We would like to offer you a 90-day probationary position," she closed her eyes and covered her mouth. For a moment she could not speak. Zuri looked up. "Mama?" Michaela nodded, quickly, tears already gathering. "Yes," she whispered into the phone. "Yes, Mom, thank you. I won't waste this chance." After the call ended, Zuri climbed into her lap. "Did you get the important job?" Michaela held her daughter so tightly the little girl laughed. "I got a chance," she said. Lorraine wiped her eyes with the corner of a towel. "Sometimes that's how miracles come," the older woman said. "Not as a whole house, just as a key." The next Monday, Michaela arrived at Sterling Logistics 30 minutes early. Her blazer was dry this time. Her shoes were still old, but carefully cleaned. In her bag, she carried a notebook, 2 pens, and Zuri's purple crayon note folded inside a small envelope. The first week nearly humbled her completely. The software was faster than anything she had used before. The routing dashboards looked like a foreign language. Acronyms flew across meetings before she could write them down. Some coworkers were polite. Others watched her with the quiet curiosity reserved for someone they expected to disappear soon. One afternoon, Michaela heard 2 employees talking near the break room. "She's the one Sterling pushed through." "Really? I heard she walked here in the rain." "Nice story. Doesn't mean she belongs in operations." Michaela stood behind the corner with a paper cup of water in her hand. For one brief second, the words hurt. Then she remembered the rain. If a storm could not turn her around, whispers certainly would not. She returned to her desk and kept learning. Every night after putting Zuri to bed, Michaela opened her laptop at Lorraine's kitchen table and studied training videos until her eyes burned. She wrote definitions on index cards. She drew routing diagrams by hand. She asked questions even when her pride begged her not to. By the 3rd week, she noticed something odd in the Northeast distribution schedule. 3 warehouse routes were overlapping by a narrow margin every Thursday and Friday, creating delays that were being corrected manually. The mistake was small enough to hide inside routine adjustments, but large enough to cost money. Michaela checked the reports twice, then a 3rd time. The next morning she brought her notes to Dean. He looked surprised to see her standing at his office door. "Yes? I think we're losing money on the Cranford, Edison, and Newark routes," she said. Dean leaned back. "How much?" Michaela swallowed. "About $14,000 a month." Dean's expression changed. He took the folder. For the next 20 minutes, he asked questions sharply, testing every assumption. Michaela answered with care. Not perfectly, carefully. 2 days later, the routing correction was approved. By the end of the month, the savings were confirmed. No one in the department mentioned the break room whispers again. On the 90th day, Michaela was called into Dean's office. Patricia sat beside him. Grayson was not there. Dean handed Michaela a single-page evaluation. She looked down. At the bottom, in Dean Whitaker's precise handwriting, were the words, "Recommend for full employment. No reservations." Michaela read the sentence once, then again. Her vision blurred. Dean cleared his throat. "You still have a lot to learn." "Yes, sir," she said quickly. "But you learn, you listen, you follow through. And when you see a problem, you do not walk past it." Michaela pressed one hand over the paper. "Thank you." Dean's voice softened just a little. "You earned it." Later, alone in the restroom where she had once tried to dry her rain-soaked blazer. With paper towels, Michaela unfolded Zuri's purple note. "You can do it." She smiled through quiet tears. "I did, baby," she whispered. Then she carefully folded the note again, placed it back near her heart, and returned to work, because the door had opened, and Michaela Price intended to walk all the way through. "Before we continue," Victor Hale said, laying a folder on the conference table, "I think the client deserves to know who is advising this account." The room fell silent. Michaela Price looked up from her notes. Across the table, the executives from Meridian Foods sat, waiting for a solution to a problem that could cost Sterling Logistics one of its most valuable contracts. Beside them, Dean Whitaker's face hardened. Patricia Hollis slowly lowered her pen. Victor did not look at any of them. He looked only at Michaela, and in that moment she understood. This was not about the contract. This was about her. 6 months had passed since Michaela became a full-time employee at Sterling Logistics. By then, the story of the rainy interview had traveled through the building in fragments. Some people told it with admiration. Others told it with a smirk, as if it were a sentimental tale exaggerated for corporate morale. Michaela never corrected anyone. She simply came early, stayed late when needed, and learned the language of logistics until the dashboards no longer looked like chaos, but like weather patterns she could read. She earned small victories quietly: a corrected delivery loop in New Jersey, a vendor scheduling improvement in Queens, a reporting template that reduced duplicate calls between dispatch and customer service. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just steady work. But steady work can irritate the kind of person who needs attention to feel important. Victor Hale had been at Sterling Logistics for 11 years. He was a senior manager with a polished office, a silver watch, and a talent for making criticism sound like concern. He had expected to become Dean Whitaker's natural successor someday. Then Michaela arrived. At first, Victor ignored her. Then he doubted her. Then, when Dean began asks her opinion during operational reviews, Victor started studying her like a problem he intended to remove. He learned about the eviction filing. He learned about the damaged credit score. He learned about the 14-month employment gap. And he carried those facts the way some men carry matches, not because they need light, but because they enjoy imagining what might burn. The Meridian Foods crisis began on a Thursday afternoon. Meridian was one of Sterling Logistics' most important regional clients, worth $2.3 million a year. For 3 weeks, their refrigerated deliveries had arrived late at several grocery distribution points. Not disastrously late, but late enough to damage trust. Meridian's operations director, Claire Benton, had made the situation clear. "If this continues," she said during the emergency call, "we'll have to reconsider the contract." Dean assigned a team. Immediately, Victor led the meeting. Michaela listened. By 9 p.m., most of the managers believed the problem came from driver availability and traffic patterns. Michaela was not convinced. She stayed after everyone left and reviewed the route logs again. Then she compared warehouse loading times, temperature check delays, vendor pickup windows, and weather reports from the past month. At 1:17 a.m. she found it. The problem was not the drivers. It was the timing sequence. Meridian's pickup windows had shifted by 20 minutes after a supplier update. But Sterling's routing system still treated the old window as fixed. Every delay that followed was being mistaken as a driver issue, when the real problem began before the trucks ever left the warehouse. By sunrise, Michaela had written a 7-page proposal. No fancy language, no dramatic promises, just a clean correction plan. Adjusted pickup windows, split route sequencing, backup loading assignments, and a weekly exception report for Meridian's team. Dean read it twice. Then he looked at her. "You prepared this alone?" "Yes, sir." "Can you explain it to the client?" Michaela felt fear rise in her throat. Then she thought of 6 miles of rain. "Yes," she said, "I can." Now in the conference room, Victor's folder sat on the table like an accusation. "I think Meridian should understand," Victor said smoothly, "that Ms. Price is still relatively new to high-level operations. Her background is unconventional." Claire Benton looked from Victor to Michaela. "What exactly are you implying?" Victor opened the folder. "Only that risk should be evaluated fully." Michaela saw the top page, her credit report. For 1 second, the room seemed to tilt. Dean stood halfway. "Victor." But Michaela raised one hand gently. "It's all right." Her voice surprised even herself. Calm, not weak, not angry, just calm. She looked at Claire Benton. "Mr. Hale is correct that my background is not traditional. I was unemployed for 14 months. My credit was damaged during a difficult period. I lost my apartment and had to rebuild from very little." No one moved. Michaela continued, "But none of that changes the routing issue in your contract." She opened her own folder and slid the proposal across the table. "This is where the delay begins. Not with driver performance, not with traffic. The first error happens 20 minutes before dispatch, inside the pickup windows sequence." Claire leaned forward. Michaela stood and walked to the screen. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. For the next 17 minutes, she explained every step. The old timeline, the new supplier update, the false delay pattern, the corrected routing structure, the savings, the accountability report. She did not attack Victor. She did not defend her dignity with speeches. She did something more powerful. She solved the problem. When she finished, Claire Benton sat back slowly. "This explains what our team has been seeing," she said. One of Meridian's analysts nodded. "The timing mismatch makes sense." Dean said nothing, but his expression had changed. Victor looked down at the table. Claire closed Michaela's proposal. "If Sterling implements this by Monday," she said, "Meridian will continue the contract." The room exhaled. A $2.3 million account, nearly gone an hour earlier, was now saved. Dean turned toward Michaela. "Well done," 2 words. But to Michaela, they felt heavier than applause. Victor quietly gathered his folder. No one asked him to leave. He simply did. As the door closed behind him, Patricia looked at the place where the credit report had been and shook her head with quiet disappointment. Michaela remained standing near the screen, one hand resting at her side. She was tired, deeply tired. But she was not ashamed. That was the difference now. Months ago, she had walked into Sterling Logistics soaked by rain, hoping someone would see beyond the surface. Today they had. Later that afternoon, Grayson Sterling called her into his office. He had already heard what happened. For a moment, he simply studied her. Then he said, "You could have embarrassed him." Michaela looked down briefly. "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you?" she thought carefully before answering. "Because I know what it feels like to be reduced to your worst season. I don't want to become the kind of person who does that to someone else." Grayson looked toward the window. Outside, Manhattan moved beneath a pale, clearing sky. After a long silence, he said, "My mother would have liked you." Michaela's eyes softened. "That means a great deal, Mr. Sterling." Grayson nodded once. "It should." When Michaela left his office, she walked back through the operations floor with her folder under one arm. This time, no one whispered. No one laughed. No one questioned why she was there. For the first time since the morning, she arrived, soaked and shivering. The room around Michaela Price finally understood something her daughter had known all along. She could do it. And she had. "Get in," Michaela Price said, lowering the passenger window as rain spilled across the glass. "I've been where you are." The young woman on the sidewalk froze. She was standing beneath a broken bus stop sign, holding a soaked folder against her chest with both hands. Her coat was too thin for the weather. Her shoes were wet. Her face carried the same quiet fear Michaela remembered from another life. For one breath neither woman moved. Then Michaela smiled gently. "I promise," she said, "this is not charity. It's just a ride." 2 years had passed since the morning Michaela walked nearly 6 miles through the rain to reach her interview at Sterling Logistics. In some ways, her life looked completely different now. She no longer slept in Lorraine Watkins's small second bedroom. She and Zuri had moved into a modest apartment with sunlight in the kitchen and a little balcony where Zuri kept 2 pots of basil she watered far too often. There was food in the refrigerator. The bills were still real, but they no longer sat on the table like threats. Michaela had become operations manager for Northeast Routing at Sterling Logistics. Her name was no longer whispered in hallways as a question. It was spoken in meetings as an answer. But success had not made her forget the sound of wet shoes on pavement. Squish, squish, squish. Some sounds stay inside a person forever, not as pain, but as a warning never to look down on someone still walking. That morning, the entire company had gathered in the main auditorium for an announcement from Grayson Sterling. He stood on stage beneath soft lights, older now in a way that made him seem less distant and more human. Behind him, a screen displayed 3 simple words: 6 Miles Initiative. Employees filled every row. Managers stood along the walls. Reporters from business publications waited near the back. Michaela sat in the front row beside Zuri, who was now 7 years old and wearing a yellow dress because, as she had explained very seriously, important days need sunshine. Grayson stepped to the microphone. 2 years ago, he began. A woman arrived at this company 9 minutes early for an interview after walking through a storm most people would have used as a reason to turn back. Michaela lowered her eyes. Zuri reached for her hand, Grayson continued. At the time, I believed I was testing her character. I was wrong. The auditorium became very still. I was testing my own. He looked out over the room. For too long, businesses have confused hardship with weakness. We look at gaps in employment, credit struggles, transportation problems, caregiving responsibilities, and we call them risk. But often, those records do not show a lack of character. They show the distance someone had to travel without help. Michaela felt her throat tighten. Grayson's voice softened. The 6 Miles Initiative will provide transportation support, paid training, interview preparation, and emergency childcare assistance for single parents and displaced workers seeking stable employment. We are not lowering standards. We are removing obstacles that never measured talent in the first place. Applause rose slowly at first. Then it filled the room. Dean Whitaker stood. Patricia Hollis stood beside him. And after a moment, the whole auditorium was on its feet. Michaela remained seated for 1 extra second, overwhelmed by the strange mercy of time. She remembered Lorraine's kitchen table, the purple crayon note, the plastic bag under her coat, the coffee Janine had handed her without explanation. She remembered the woman who had offered her a ride. And she remembered refusing, not because help was wrong, but because she had not yet understood that dignity did not require suffering. Alone. After the ceremony, Grayson found Michaela near the windows overlooking the city. You helped build this, he said. Michaela shook her head. I just walked to an interview. No, Grayson replied. You taught me the difference between watching someone struggle and choosing to stand beside them. For a moment, Michaela looked at the man who had once observed the world from behind tinted glass. Then she smiled. Your mother would be proud of you. Grayson's eyes shifted toward the rain-dark skyline. I hope so. That evening, as Michaela drove home with Zuri asleep in the back seat, rain began to fall again. Not a cruel storm, just a steady Manhattan rain, silver beneath the streetlights. At a corner near an old bus stop, Michaela noticed a young woman walking alone. Clutching a folder beneath her coat, Michaela slowed the car. For one moment, memory and present stood side by side. Then she pulled over. The young woman looked frightened when the window lowered. Michaela kept her voice calm and kind. Get in, she said. I've been where you are. The woman hesitated. I have an interview, she whispered. I can't be late. Michaela nodded. Then let's make sure you aren't. Slowly, the young woman opened the door and climbed in. Warm air filled the space between them. In the back seat, Zuri stirred and opened her eyes. Mama, she whispered. It's okay, baby, Michaela said. We're just helping someone get through the rain. Zuri smiled sleepily and closed her eyes again. The car pulled back into traffic. Outside, the rain continued to fall on glass towers, crowded sidewalks, and people carrying invisible stories beneath their coats. Michaela drove carefully, both hands steady on the wheel, and somewhere deep in her pocketbook, folded inside a small envelope, the purple crayon note remained. You can do it. Years had passed. The paper had softened at the edges, but the message had not changed, because sometimes a life does not transform all at once. Sometimes it begins with $6.40, a dry resume, A child's faith, a stranger's kindness, and one person who finally decides to stop the car.